This is a typical East African home. We use wood, charcoal, and waste as biomass to fuel our homes the same way our great-grandparents did. In 2019, biomass provided roughly 80% of Eastern Africa's energy, used by 75 to 97% of people. Our current energy systems are similar to that of the 19th century. This contrasts with today's disconnected, big electricity generation projects, mostly in fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal. These fuels are produced by 20th century technologies, which need a lot of money and leaves us with bigger debts. But the 21st century is full of limits. Everyone wants more energy for basic needs and a better life. However, population growth and our chosen development models have led to a decline of natural resources as land, water, and clean air are harder to find. We need a global energy transition that slows climate change, restores the natural world, and improves lives. So what might this energy transition look like in Eastern Africa? Here are 3 stories of what might happen in the next 30 years.
We were such opposites.
Why do you waste your breath in these protests? To develop like the Asian giants or the West, we need a lot of energy. There's no shame in adopting second-hand energy technologies, since we will produce shoes, clothes, and other things here and sell them worldwide.
But times have changed. What Asia or other regions did, we cannot do now because the world won't allow it. The climate won't, the trade barons won't, and the robots won't. And what about the effect on natural habitats? That's irreversible. Can't you see?
Who cares if the grey parrot becomes extinct? It never fed anyone. People need jobs now.
And as usual, we would agree to disagree. I'm a teacher and an activist. He's an economist. We saw the world differently. It was the year 2020. My partners and I were ready to change our region's energy policies. Policies that rode on political power and money. We tried to bring change through peaceful protests, international press, and social media, but our governments responded aggressively. In the end, we had no choice. I was among the last to give in. Then my boyfriend asked,
"So, will you marry me now?"
Yes! As I prepared for our wedding, I followed the energy news, watching as our governments agreed to one bad deal after another. As usual, my husband saw no problem with this.
Now we are on the right path. Coal and oil are cheap, and adopting them will give us energy independence. Hydro is well established and has no greenhouse emissions, and we know how to control the risks.
Unless you count the concrete used and the way...
If it works, who cares? Having a centralized energy pool means more power for the region's cities, which are growing faster than the rural areas.
But these older technologies are only bought because they cost more than multiple small renewable systems, which suit our people scattered in rural areas. In the end, you can't be fighting all the time. Little by little, we settled into the routines of children, home, family, and work. Connection of urban households to the electricity grid ramped up, along with repeated scandals on pricing. In the slums, I noticed more tapping into the main lines. Did authorities receive kickbacks to look the other way? Maybe, maybe not. I have to admit, urban energy was better. Charcoal use in the cities reduced and some forest areas were recovering. However, rural areas and city slums were suffering. Where large projects were built, people were forced to move or left because life was too hard. The focus was on industry and urban areas, not rural agriculture. I remember the region's grand gala of 2030, when the last link of the Eastern Africa power pool was actualized. Then, we were exporting oil and manufacturing grew rapidly. Despite my earlier doubts, people are getting jobs and lives are getting better.
See? The great development dream is working.
By the end of the 2030s, would the dream turn out to be merely a mirage?
For a while there, things looked really good on the energy front.
I always feared it was too good to be true. When the deal makers planned their coal and oil projects, they forgot about climate change or assumed it would only be a problem much later. Instead, because our exports were produced using fossil fuels, they became more expensive to cover the global carbon tax. So people stopped buying our goods. We couldn't sell our oil either, as many countries made a quick switch to electric and hybrid vehicles. Our manufacturing industries could not compete with the robotic factories abroad. We just hadn't kept up technologically. Many businesses shut down, many people were unemployed. Crime rose in the cities until we rarely left our neighborhoods because of fear. Then there was the weather.
Bad policy is ruining farms in our region.
It's more than policy. The climate itself has become an enemy. In the countryside, it was hard to know when to sow or when to reap. Should farmers plan for drought or floods? It was hard to know. The swings between extremes were becoming more and more violent. Pollution was also increasing, especially around the factories where waste was being pumped into groundwater and streams. By the time our children were ready for university, the digital economy was the main employer and dominated by the youth.
Seems our energy investments are paying off, with the digital world being a heavy user of power.
True, but the carbon tax is forcing other businesses to close. And what about all the money we borrowed to pay for our dirty energy? How can we pay that back? As for hydropower, climate change, deforestation, haphazard rain and silt have all reduced the power the dams gave us. Now we are dependent on Ethiopia's large dams for our electricity. That is very hard to handle. The international grid once brought the region together. Now we feel frustrated and resentful whenever the prices go up. A few days ago, I dug out my notes about small-scale distributed energy systems. Once, it was just an idea. Now, these systems are used worldwide. These energy systems would have created a more equitable society.
Are you sure you're not dreaming?
Perhaps I am. I hate the world around me. I hate being trapped in my middle-class neighborhood. I am surrounded by complacent people who believe they made their own success. I hate the bad policies, the energy systems we built in the 2020s, and the corruption we tolerated. We just got lucky in a rigged system. I've stopped arguing with my husband about this. We know each other too well now. My children, they mostly ignore me. Too comfortable to think deeply about anyone less fortunate. But I still whisper in the ears of my students. Resistance is an instinct that never goes away. One day, things will be forced to change because too many are suffering. Be ready for the next revolution.
Things were looking up. Not only had I just received my master's in journalism, one of the region's best brains had chosen to mentor me. I was ready for the good things in life. At work, I eventually got posted to the environment desk. As I traveled, I began to notice that the weather pattern was changing. Too hot and dry, or too rainy and flooded. But my monthly highlight was the meetings with the professor who was mentoring me. Prof, as I would call him, would buy lunch and I would bring my articles. Then we'd analyze what was happening in the region. His sharp mind turned me into a believer in markets, in their efficiency, their dynamism, and their ability to transform societies. Prof and I were to write a book in 2050. It was supposed to be the story of how Eastern Africa became the economic powerhouse of the continent. But the story didn't turn out exactly the way we thought it would. Even as I worked on environmental stories, energy remained the biggest buzz, with new technologies, new ideas, new money, and its stories came at us with every extreme weather event or episode of volatile energy prices. I loved discussing these stories at our monthly lunches. Prof was deeply invested in finding coherent energy plans, but our leaders didn't seem interested in creating any policies. That disinterest proved disastrous with the 2025 financial crash. The rich nations were the first to go down, but we were all living on borrowed money. We looked to our leaders for guidance, but most quietly served their terms, or simply resigned and dodged accountability. My stories about the environment were increasingly dominated by climate change, as it became a frightening reality everywhere. That forced people to give the Paris Climate Agreement stronger legal force and accelerated a shift to low-carbon energy systems. Exceptional turmoil brought more security forces into our region, which destabilized global oil prices, speeding up the shift to electric vehicles in the rich world. It was an exciting time to be a journalist, but a scary time to be a citizen of this region. We were just waiting, wondering, drifting. Before the crash, prospectors had been looking in Africa for minerals needed by clean energy technologies. They had quietly staked their claims, but now the invasions began. The first invasion was the clean energy and natural gas companies, ready to exploit their mineral rights or find new ones. You see, huge loans initially taken by our governments to fund fossil projects that are now obsolete had to be paid up. The easiest way out was for our governments to accept huge payouts offered by rich nations. But there was a catch to their offer. The rich nations in return took our minerals and rare earth metals for their own renewable technology investments. Well, it seemed like mere barter exchange, but on face value, we were the biggest losers. The second invasion was agricultural lands. Prof and I considered land a commodity like everything else. If the foreigners will pay for it, let them do so, or so we thought. I wrote the stories of tycoons and corporations paying our governments large sums to develop fertile land in remote areas of our countries. But sooner or later, our farmers were forced to sell out or move, unable to compete with these commercial farms. The third invasion was companies exploiting the new carbon markets. Creative local investors in Eastern Africa had found new ways to use the global carbon markets to reward our people who restored degraded lands or protected healthy habitats. Eventually, our local companies were taken over by the international traders. The results? Financial profits went to foreigners who focused on the climate emergency and dismissed local needs and cultural traditions. I saw my people lose control of their forests and land. The fourth invasion was exporting electrical power. Our development plans called for more manufacturing, but there was little industry in the region. As a result, the large-scale power projects in hydro, gas, solar and wind, built in the 2020s, were now producing more electricity than Eastern Africans could consume or afford. But there is a ready market for clean power in North Africa and Europe. The power companies of our region connected their excess power to the European grid using ultra-high voltage lines provided by China. As our power went north, everyone on the deal earned valuable clean energy credits that could be sold for profit or used to meet the Paris Agreement's targets. Prof was delighted to see the EAPP back in business. But it wasn't due to any great regional corporation. Instead, this was market-driven by companies in Europe and North Africa buying Eastern Africa's power. So much electricity left the region that local people were still unable to have the light and power they needed. Only major African businesses and wealthy households could afford it. Local people objected, but government leaders just saw good deals, new incomes, reduced deficits, and a more comfortable life for themselves. Any downside was just the price of development. Time and circumstance were not sympathetic to oil and coal, and by 2040, both had faded from our energy systems. Many of the big oil projects I wrote about in such excitement in those early days never took off or were half built and then abandoned. Now it was time to face the long-term consequences of the 4 invasions of minerals, agricultural land, carbon markets, and power exports. The evolution of Eastern Africa's energy system moved in 2 very different directions. In one, there was a large-scale clean energy revolution, a world of global business serviced by a low-carbon economy and energy system, efficiently meeting the needs of those ready to accept and pay for what it delivers. It was Prof's dream come true. The other system is a mishmash of whatever works. The poorest can no longer afford any of it. Many of these people have been pushed out of their land in rural areas and even in cities. Slums are strung with dangerous and illegal electric wires. The working poor cope with cheap solutions, solar and wind installations that rarely work long enough to pay off the debts used to buy them. They rely on charitable efforts to give them more efficient wood stoves or create methane gas from urban sewage and toilets. They rarely succeed. For the middle class, there are multiple renewable energies on offer, including a few local technologies that show promise. Most renewables are small-scale and off-grid, rarely integrated with each other. Some work well, others are cheap second-hand technologies from other continents. The weak ones rarely last. Frankly, we're nothing but a dumping site for obsolete and shoddy goods, from cars to solar panels. Good business for the middlemen, but not for buyers. The global energy transition to a low-carbon world is thriving in 2050. But here in our region, the transition is not working for most people. All these changes and invasions have created a queer patchwork across the land. I have pictures of the ugly scars of mining operations, areas barren of indigenous plants, birds, and animals. We are biologically impoverished, with a wealth of Eastern African life reduced to an ancient, magical mythology. I have pictures showing vast grey areas where shanties spill out of the old city centres, next to wealthier neighbourhoods boasting a rich garden green canopy. And I have contrasting pictures of rural areas with tidy crops parcelled out in neat lines. The rivers here are often a bright sterile green of fertilized algae which sucks out the oxygen fish need. All these busy enterprises have private security firms keeping order and reducing theft. They say it's necessary to keep our own people safe. So who counts as our own people? My last discussions with Prof kept asking this question. We'd joked that all our fellow Africans who run these businesses are like the old colonial tribal chieftains. They control the land and decide who gets which benefits. They've signed the international agreements that handed our region over to outsiders, even though our ancestors taught us to liberate ourselves and control our own destiny. As for workers and professionals, we learned to be docile and had seen enough violence not to want any more. Many of us want to leave, but where can we go? Who will take us in? So that's the book. Our world is enjoying this fragile new world order, this development. Me, I find it hard to celebrate what I now see.
So, where do I start? Well, I remember when my wife would want to leave the city while I'd want to stay. Then we'd switch. But eventually we agreed and left. The marvels of the city had worn thin with overcrowding and pollution. So, we moved to a smaller town where life was easier, cheaper, and we could make a bigger impact and do something that matters. We quickly found out how different life was. There were barely any services, such as water, electricity, or security. But there was a robust community. Despite the connections not being very legal, everyone here worked with their neighbors and formed networks to meet their needs. Sometimes, those connections weren't exactly legal, but we had no option. Eventually, we adjusted. My wife, who used to work at the Ministry of Health, found her place first, working at the local clinic as a volunteer, then with the local council helping translate national policies into workable solutions on the ground. Since I used to work at the Ministry of Energy, I began a small solar business. This was inspired by my children who needed dependable power to access the internet. Then, success. We brought electricity to our children's school, and the school sponsor fully bought in and set up an energy fund. It proved that renewable energy could challenge the bigger pay-as-you-go companies, which weren't as affordable as they seemed. While not everyone was supportive, I didn't expect a big fight from the central government, who accused me of undermining the energy providers to our region. One day, the central government cut off a neighborhood I had wired up with renewable electricity. The local people, both young and old, protested in such numbers that it made the national news. Progress was hard, but worth it. With time, we realized that nothing was off the table, especially when the government was not able to help us. The unreliable weather meant we had to find new crops and grow different types of food. In my renewables business, we were now selling energy to local computer servers as well as households. Energy storage had improved a lot, but a mix of technologies was still more reliable. Solar, wind, biogas, with some backup fossil fuels. Despite the hard times, young people were thriving as masters of the digital world, using it to provide the social glue, circulate information, and help with payment systems. Raw determination and rapid learning was the rule, supported by laughter in the face of frequent and frightening hazards. These shocks affected everyone, making the role of the national government clear, including cooperation and policies in the region and the world. But when times were getting harder and we needed the government's help, it was hard to find. My wife passed away. Our last born also fell very ill. A new epidemic was killing us by the thousands. I wanted to believe that better times lay ahead, but I had no idea what better meant anymore. The epidemic eventually subsided. Our last born got better, but the blow of losing my wife was really hard to get over. It was difficult to adjust to this new normal. I began to think a lot more about the legacy I wanted to leave and decided to hand over my energy business to my children. It was an interesting time because many of the bigger energy projects were declining opening up the space for smaller energy systems like ours. Low demand and production glut for oil drove down its price. Coal-fired power plants were killed off by enforcement of carbon prices. Also, many of the big dams were struggling. Building the Eastern Africa power pool proved difficult. As most of the old power projects became white elephants, gas and geothermal became the most reliable of the remnants of the central grid. The situation reminded me of a hyrax. It looks like a large rodent, but its closest relative is the elephant. In the energy world, the white elephants were slowly shuffling off the scene, while the small, nimble hyrax were increasing in number like the many small-scale technologies that run the microgrids and district energy systems of the region. That was the inspiration behind our business name, Hyrax Energy Solutions. We were growing because we were more technologically suited to the dispersed populations of our time. My youngest daughter, the one who barely survived the epidemic that took her mother, has now decided to run for office. She wants to make central government effective again. This new generation amazes me. As children of hard times, they used their education and pragmatism to find opportunities in this unpredictable world. They understood that clean air, not energy, is the scarce resource of our times. We are still battered by weather and unusual diseases. But have things improved? I think so. We have more control over our own affairs. Scientists say that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is no longer increasing, but others fear climatic change cannot be stopped because we began too late. Around our town, firewood and charcoal use has reduced, with many households resorting to electricity and biogas stoves. The big energy projects still function, but much of their power goes into transport where it's harder to replace oil. I still miss my wife. We fled to this town so many years ago. Now I cannot remember what our life was like before. It became home in every sense. I'm proud of our small contribution towards a hybrid economy and mixed energy systems. We had no plan. We just started with what was there and what was needed. Now see how far we've come, eh?